Core.
You are listening to Core, a show on Code Zero Radio that plays bands located in the Fox Cities. A show to find and discover new music. Hosted by Andy McNamara.
Hello everybody, welcome to Fox Cities Core. I'm your host, Andy McNamara, and you're really tuned in for a great show today. If this is your first time tuning into Fox Cities Core, we feature artists and entertainment in the Fox Cities. We give our listeners a chance to call in, ask questions. We'll take questions through the social media live stream accounts. We are broadcasting simultaneously on WCZR Code Zero Radio, along with Facebook and YouTube. My guests in the studio today are, it's a show I've been looking forward to for quite a while. It's my, if I can call them friends, Gavin Schmitt and Eric Wulterkens, hosts of the Milwaukee Mafia and the Fox Cities Murder Mayhem podcasts. Welcome to the show, you guys.
Thanks, Andy, for having us.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited. I'm not going to lie, really clenched up in the butt area right now.
Well, you guys have been doing these shows for a while now. I want to let everybody know you guys have been friends since, I believe, kindergarten. Is that
that's what Eric
accurate
says.
Information?
I
So
would
this
say
is
that
disputed.
It might even be pre-kindergarten.
See, I don't remember this at all, but that's what he says.
What's your story, Eric? What's your first memory of the two of you together?
Well, I guess the first memory I would remember is when we were at his house and we were making the little movie with the video game figure or the action figures. So I don't know when that was, but
Yeah, that I remember. I mean, that's a few years. That's not kindergarten. That's
No,
a few
it's
years later, but
that's probably second, third grade, maybe.
sure.
So, but it's been a long time.
And Eric, you've been, since I've known you, I haven't known you as long as Gavin, but you've been in entrepreneurial stuff. And Gavin, as long as I've known you, you've been like a history guy.
Yeah.
History as long as like pop culture, movies, films, stuff like that. And you guys ended up colliding and putting your talents together to do these podcasts, which are very interesting, by the way. And maybe it would be a good start to let everybody know what the podcasts, the names again, and what they entail, what they're going to get if they tune into those podcasts.
Do you want this?
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
I'll do podcast 2, you do podcast 1.
Okay, which one's one and which one's two?
I think you can figure that out.
Okay, well, our primary podcast is the Milwaukee Mafia podcast, which, if you search Milwaukee Mafia, you'll find it. And we roughly chronologically go through the whole story of organized crime in Milwaukee and the state from the early 1900s up to today. Right now, for those who listen, we're up to about the 1950s. So,
Yeah, and the second podcast is called Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, and we created that one after Milwaukee Mafia. We just kind of got our feet wet with Milwaukee Mafia, saw the success, and something I've always wanted to do was have a very localized podcast. I feel like local podcast is kind of an untapped market, something that's upcoming, so I wanted to create something that was local, and Gavin had written a book, Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, which was just murders that have happened around the Fox Cities, so I proposed the idea to him, well, could we turn this into a podcast? And so that we started that shortly after, probably 3 months after Milwaukee Mafia, I would say.
So when you read Gavin's books prior,
Some of them.
You knew about them.
Yeah.
yeah, don't make him lie. He doesn't read.
Was the subject something that was interesting to you, or were you more interested in how to get these stories in more of a sort of a podcast digestible format?
Honestly, when we first started talking about Milwaukee Mafia, the Mafia really has no interest to me, or didn't. I didn't really get interested until we started making the podcast because it really forced me to listen to the stories and find out what the Mafia was all about. And being that I come from an entrepreneur side of things, the Mafia has become very interesting to me because the Mafia is essentially a business. So it's a business with murder thrown into it. So it's kind of like the perfect blend of us two. I like the business side. He likes the killing side. So
In both podcasts kind of follow a similar format. Eric's the host and kind of the MC of the show, and then Gavin comes in with the historical side. Is it hard? Like, where are you finding these topics for each episode? Is it from your prior books? Or are you doing research specifically for these podcasts?
Well, it depends. The Milwaukee Mafia one, most of the research has already been done, just from previous book research, and I have to fine tune it for podcast notes, but they're basically already put together. Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, sometimes a week prior, I don't know what the topic is going to be. So I've got a list of stories that I know are out there, but they're not researched yet. So I'm like, I got to get on the air next week. I better pick one of these. So that's really on the fly, but it's fun and exciting to have that week-to-week deadline. And even though I do love the true crime and I love the mafia stuff, kind of like Eric was saying, I love the local, what really makes it local. It's not as huge of a market necessarily, but it's something that I think people can really connect with more. So I enjoy those stories when people are like, oh yeah, I know that name, or I know that business, so it's really fun just like finding these stories that aren't out there yet.
How's the listenership been for the Fox Cities? Because obviously Milwaukee Mafia is a bigger market. That doesn't mean that just because it's Milwaukee, you're getting, specifically people from Milwaukee tuning in. But has the response to Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem been good?
it actually has been good. It is significantly smaller than Milwaukee Mafia, but due to the fact it's not just that for the first probably 8 months of Milwaukee Mafia, we were doing it on a weekly basis. So obviously, twice as many episodes, you get twice as many downloads. So, and on top of that, the fact that obviously we're reaching a smaller viewership with Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, I feel like the amount of downloads we get with that one are pretty good for the market that we're trying to tap into, basically. So
yeah, I would agree with that. And jumping off of that point, Mafia is just built in. I mean, you put Mafia on something, you say, look, this is the Amish Mafia, and people will tune into it just because of that word. It really grabs the attention of some people. Whereas Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, I mean, it's basically building from the ground up. There's no built-in market there. So I think it's doing well. I wish it did better, but considering the fact that we're basically starting from, square one with that one without any, people aren't actively going online and searching Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem. So I think it's going well considering what we have to start with.
yeah, definitely.
How did you research for the name? Obviously, you wanted something.
No, actually,
No.
that was just the name of the book. If you look, Gavin's book is called Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem. So we're just like, can we make that a podcast? And then I'm like, Gavin, can we use the name and not have your publisher get mad at us? And he's like, yeah, they won't care.
They won't care.
So
How many books do you have published currently?
As of this moment, there are 9, but there's supposed to be a 10th one out next month. So I say supposed to be because until I see it, but yeah, it's supposed to be 10 next month.
Busy guy.
Yeah. Can I throw something in? This is totally random. Okay, I was not here for this. So Eric, correct me if I'm wrong.
okay.
So Eric was at some event where he was like talking about podcasting, and he mentioned the names of the podcasts, and he got called out by a dude in the audience. The guy's like, you can't use those. Those are already existing names. The guy got really upset about it, apparently. I didn't see it, but
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. He's like, he's like, you know that those are both books, right? And I'm like, yeah, the guy that I do the podcast with wrote the books. And he's like, oh, like, so yeah.
I think that's pretty funny. But I'm also, I'm flattered that the guy knew those were books. So.
Yeah. So somebody's reading Gavin's
Somebody's
books out
reading
there.
out there, yeah.
And Gavin, like I said, you've got a big interest in movies.
Sure.
What's your biggest passion as far as when it comes to books? Is it do you enjoy like Wisconsin history, or do you
Sure.
enjoy pop culture?
Sure. Okay, that was not at all where that question was going. I have a very narrow window of what I read. I love Wisconsin history, and I mean it's basically what I do professionally. So it's both a personal and a professional interest. Otherwise, I read philosophy, very boring philosophy stuff. I don't read too much pop culture. I do read about movies because I love movies, but that's secondary. And beyond that, like, I almost never read fiction, and I get scolded so much for that, but I just don't. I just like learning. There's too much to learn.
And I think it's really interesting one of the biggest things with our podcast is that Gavin does a very, very good job of taking boring history that people might not want to hear and applying murders to it to make it more interesting. And then you get that blend of local or Milwaukee history, as well as you get that blood and death so that people will stay interested in it. So it's a very interesting format that he's developed that I don't think you see a lot in the podcasting space.
Oh, thank you.
What do you think is the big pull towards crime, murder podcasts? Because tying pop culture into it, there's a show on Hulu called Only Murders in the Building, which was written by Steve Martin and some other couple other people that kind of ties in. They decided to do a podcast about murders in the building. I don't know if you've seen it.
I'm not familiar, no.
I have seen it, and it's very good, so I highly recommend anybody take it. Anybody out there that hasn't watched it, watch it.
It's pretty funny. And then in the new season of Dexter that they had, it centers around somebody's doing a crime murder podcast about the butcher from Miami. And not to do any spoilers, but it seems like podcasts are so under pop culture now as well, specifically murder and crime podcasts. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I would just say that all stems from Serial. If you haven't seen Serial, but Serial is one of the biggest podcasts that's ever been produced, and it was based directly around a true crime murder. You know, it was somebody going in and looking at a murder and saying, was this person really guilty? So I think that's the biggest driver of it. And I mean, as we all know, everybody just loves, well, a huge faction of the community just loves murder. I mean, it's one of those mysterious, unknown things that people don't fully understand and find interesting to hear about.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me. Yeah, I know that in the last few years, and I think this is kind of what you're getting at. I mean, true crime has really exploded, both podcasts and documentaries and everything else. It's bigger in the last 5 years than it ever. I mean, it's always been there, but yeah, I mean, Serial's probably a big part of that. And I don't know. I think also it's the marketing has kind of changed who it's tapped into, because I don't think this is true for our podcast, but generally speaking, true crime is catered towards women, which really surprises me, because I wouldn't think that. I'd be like, why are women so fascinated with these terrible, heinous crimes? But actually, the bulk of true crime readers, listeners, documentary watchers are women, and I think somebody figured that out along the way, and it's a whole new market that just wasn't there because people aren't catering to women often enough.
Have you done a podcast, either Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem or Milwaukee Mafia, either podcast? Have you done one where a family member or relative of somebody that was featured has contacted you, and either been angry about anything or supportive?
I don't think specifically because of the podcast.
No, but I mean, you could talk about some of it, because he's had plenty of experiences with that, with books and things like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've had many family members contact me, but I don't recall it specific to the podcast. Do you want me to?
No, yeah, you can. But it's when they're contacting you, like, can you let us know how you do your research? Like, you're contacting these, I'm assuming, like the FBI and places like that to get information. I mean, when they contact you, is it over facts that they might dispute, or, you know, they're upset? I'll kind of let you expand.
Yeah, it's happened where somebody said that the facts were wrong or something was misrepresented. That's extremely rare. More often than not, there's either a very small group where they're just upset that it's brought up at all, but the vast majority, I mean, 80, 90, 95 maybe even percent, if I get contacted, it's generally people saying thank you for bringing it out there. I get that a lot when I do live appearances. I have people who come up after, and they'll say, hey, my grandfather was in your book, and I really appreciate that because, you know, we knew something was up, but our parents wouldn't talk about it. And we've got that extra step removed now where, you know, if your parents are out there committing crimes, you may be kind of embarrassed about that. But if your grandparents are out there committing crimes, that's not as embarrassing. Then you can be like, hey, that's pretty cool. You know, not that it's cool to go out and kill people, but you're that step removed where it's not a blot or a shame on you directly. So I think like it's reached that point where it's not where people are going to get upset. It's more often where people are just happy to know something that they kind of felt, but they never really understood. And yeah, that's most of the emails or personal contacts I get is people saying thank you, or they're just curious. They're like, I think my grandfather was this, this, and this. Have you ever run across this name? It's very rare that people are actually upset about it.
How are you finding the stories that you decide to do? Because it seems like you're doing a lot of obscure stuff.
Oh yeah,
It's just stuff you just can't, which I think is a cool thing about the podcast. These are stories you just can't reach out, and they're all like on some website, easily to digest. Eric said you did some from your book, but how are you finding the Fox City stories?
The Fox Cities ones kind of stumble from one to the next. So right now there's a streak of things in 1968. We're going to be doing 1968 for a while because I'll become aware of a crime and then I'll have to search and find all the old newspaper articles and that sort of thing. And in the context, not in the context, but, you know, in the course of doing that, I'll see the other headlines and I'll be like, oh, here was another trial that was going on at the time, or here's another crime that they're investigating. And a lot of times it'll lead from one to another, or when one crime happens, you know, the newspaper will make reference. We haven't seen something like this since this other thing. So a lot of it is things, like I said, from week to week, I don't even know about. They tend to lead one to the next. And it's been fascinating because we just recently did one that involved bank robbery. And for the people from the Fox Cities who are listening in, which is, I think, most people probably today, I had never known that in the 1960s, the Sherwood Bank was robbed. And Sherwood, for anybody here who doesn't know, is this small community like right outside of Kaukauna. And that had never been told to me. No one's ever like, oh yeah, when I was a kid, they robbed the Sherwood Bank. So like just even finding these stories, I'm like, why are these not part of our conversation? So it's been really fun stumbling on these things week to week and kind of bringing them back into the consciousness.
Have you done the Sherwood episode already?
It's recorded, but I don't think it'll be out for
it's not
a
going
couple
to be out
weeks.
until probably February, I think.
That sounds super fascinating for all the reasons you just stated. It's stuff in our own backyard. You had an episode about the Ufo Education Center in Appleton, which I found super entertaining, and it really I Googled it right away, and I Googled a couple things from a couple shows, and why I asked how you're finding the information, because most of the Google links that came back were links to your podcast.
All right.
But I did Google the address, and it, like you say in the episode, it's just a little house.
Yeah.
So can you maybe tell our listeners a little bit about the Appleton UFO Science and Education Center? And like, I didn't know anything about it, and I'm assuming most people didn't, but that's one reason to tune into the Fox Cities Murder Mayhem show.
You want this one?
I don't remember the episode well enough to really say I think you probably should take it.
Okay, so I'll take this, but the reason I ask if Eric wants it is because that episode specifically is because of Eric. And Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, as the name strongly implies, is very heavy on the murder, much less so on the mayhem. And when I had kind of hinted to Eric that I had heard about a UFO story, he was kind of insistent. He's like, we got to get that UFO story. So kind of put it together from there. But yeah, that same as anything else. It's once you get a couple names that you can look up in the old newspaper archives, you look them up. They'll lead you to other names, and you look to. I mean, it's a lot of just. It's tedious work. It's work I enjoy doing, so it's not tedious to me. But to most people, I could see it being very tedious because it's just a lot of searching in archives and then compiling what you find. And yeah, so there was this place in Appleton, just a small house on Coolidge Avenue called the Ufo Education Center. And it was run by this lady whose name was Charlotte Blob, but her name is spelled B-L-O-B, like blob, which, of course, somebody with the last name Blob is going to be interested in space. And she claimed that she had contact with men from Venus who looked like they were Norwegians and had been on their spacecraft, and that they wanted to help civilization steer away from nuclear power and live in peace with each other. And things that, I mean, if people are out there and they believe that, I don't mean to knock you, but to many people, I think it sounds pretty strange. So it was interesting just to see how many things came out of this. And then there wasn't that much murder or mayhem, but there were a few interesting things where they got accused later on of brainwashing people. A family ends up breaking into this house and kidnapping, quote unquote, kidnapping their daughter back because the daughter's been brainwashed. So it's more of a cult story than a murder or mayhem story. But cults are just as fascinating, if not more so. We actually got a really strong response to that episode. So, maybe we're wasting time on the murder. It's just to be doing more cults. I don't know.
It was super interesting. Like I said, I Googled the address. I found an old realtor.com. The house was sold like 10 years ago. I was clicking around pictures inside the house and just imagining this. Because I think you said in the episode there's like 10 people or more living there at any given time. Which brings me to my next question. Have you ever thought about doing like a Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem like bus tour? Like if this podcast picked up.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that would be something that would, even as like a one-off, do you think that's something people would sign up for, to pay to drive around Appleton and see some sights from Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem?
I mean, I guess we've never talked about it.
I've never thought of it.
I mean, Gavin has kind of kicked around the idea for a very long time of doing like an app in Milwaukee for the Mafia, takes you from site to site and tells you about the different sites in Milwaukee. So I think if we were to do something along those lines, I don't know that we would do a bus tour, but maybe just an app that took you on a walking tour of the Appleton area. But actually, I think the bus tour would be, I mean, as long as we had enough people, yeah, why wouldn't it work?
Yeah.
So
I mean, you'd have to rent the bus, but
yeah.
I think it'd be cool.
Hence, we need enough people.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool. That to me almost walks the fine line, because I'm approaching these things as history. I'm not trying to sensationalize or really make a spectacle of them. I mean, I guess that's naturally part of it, but that's not the intent. So I'm not opposed to the bus idea. I like the bus idea, but I don't know how much I'd feel comfortable being the one to lead it, because I wouldn't want to be like, look at the terrible thing that happened here.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
Taking somebody to their house on Coolidge Avenue and saying it was a UFO, cult at one point in time. So.
Yeah, but it's something to think about. Definitely that.
I would sign up. I'll buy a ticket for that bus tour. Just seems like something that might go over well during like a mile of music, or I don't know. Anyways, just throwing it out there to see if you guys ever thought of that, because you already are like laying the groundwork and coming up with like a list of places in Appleton that nobody knows about. Well, unless you're like a small handful of people possibly, but they're not putting the information out there.
Right.
So another thing I wanted to ask you about, you did an episode recently. I don't have the name of it here, but you talk about a place off Prospect, which was called the Colonial Inn. Do you ever get small details wrong? Because you guys call it the Colony Inn in the episode, and it drives me nuts.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I only know this because I stayed there for my 21st birthday with my brother and a few other people, and it was the dirtiest, like, trashiest hotel. You mentioned in the episode that there was, and this is, your story takes place in, like, I think 1970. And you mentioned that there's blood stains or stains, and there was in 1999 too. I mean, this place was trashy, but again, it was something I did not know this story ever happened there. And just to kind of condense it down, there was it was a former police officer, an off duty that would moonlight doing security at the Colonial Inn, and he ends up disappearing, and they find him murdered, his body dumped in Wapaka.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's interesting because for me, it's like this place is in my memory because we rented 2 rooms for $25 each in 1999. And just hearing the descriptions, like, it's like I didn't know that took place, at this Colonial Inn, which again is something that I find fascinating about your show and why it pulls you in. And I was talking to my wife and I said, it's almost like you're watching TV or a TV show. Like, I find myself listening very interested. After the show gets over, I find myself very entertained, but then I have to listen to, go back and listen to episodes again because I was so entertained that I sort of, couldn't recall things afterwards. But,
Oh, man, we found our listener here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but I mean, I guess it's where that was going, was small little details like the Colonial Inn, Colony Inn. Do you ever you find something like that, you're not so detail-oriented where you feel like you need to go back and, oh, no, we said Colony Inn and it's Colonial Inn. And do you feel that maybe having a podcast now, especially dealing with historical aspects, do you feel a little weight on your shoulders as far as we have to get this right because otherwise people are going to replicate small details that might be incorrect and they'll just keep getting replicated like a bad game of telephone?
I guess I got to take that one, huh?
Yeah, I guess I've never really thought about that. So,
Any mistakes, I mean, I'll own that. That's on me. I don't know specifically about that, how that got goofed up. My guess is that when researching that episode, I was not specifically researching that building. And so that's on me. If I would have done that, if I got the name wrong, I would have realized I got the name wrong. I was researching specifically the crime, and at the time of the crime, I think it was called like the Embassy or something. It had a different name.
Names, yeah.
And yeah, so that's on me. The problem I ran into with that episode specifically is I did less research from scratch from the newspaper articles. I did some, but there already was a website which was very detailed. So I was like, I'm not reinventing the wheel for this one. I'm just going to take what they have and modify it so I'm not plagiarizing them. And, maybe that was in theirs. And now I'm doing what you were just suggesting, like, oh, no, now I've copied something incorrectly that they did. So, I mean, yeah, that would definitely be a concern because that's something I've run into a lot with the Mafia stuff. And not so much with my own writing or my own, speaking or whatever so much, but you do see that. You see where somebody puts something out there online, typically online, and I don't know if they got it wrong or if they just completely made it up or where some of this stuff comes from. But, once it's out there, somebody else will take it and then they'll put it on their website and they'll put it on their website and so on. And that's the thing. Like, there's for people who are interested in the Milwaukee Mafia, if you look up don't do this because you're going to get terrible results. But if you look up like current members of Milwaukee Mafia, you'll find lists out there. And I'll tell you right now, those lists are crap. They're not real. But somebody put that list out there, and then other websites are like, oh, here's all the members that are in Milwaukee right now, and half the names on that list, I think they just made up. I don't even think they're real people. So yeah, I'm aware that once something is out there, it gets duplicated. So it's something I'm conscious of, and yeah, if I goofed up, which apparently I did.
It's minor. I was just using that as the lead into the
Well,
question.
no, but it's a valid point. It's a valid point. I mean, it's name should be correct. So if that was goofed up, we should issue a correction, because we don't want that out there. We don't want people passing along false information. We have to rely on being truthful, and that's our credibility there. So.
And I think it's probably important to point out that we just simply don't have the resources to, something as small as that, yes, it is an error, but we don't have the resources. We don't have the team that can thoroughly research this like somebody that is a huge podcast.
I mean, we are the team.
Yeah, we are the team. Well, we do have a producer now. So,
yes, we do.
Yeah.
We do. But as far as going into it.
Yeah, so... Yes, we try to get everything as correct as possible, but being in the narrow niche that we are right now, there are going to be mistakes made, and we hope that our listeners, like you're doing right now, will point those mistakes out to us so that we can issue corrections for them. But with the limited resources we have, at least we're getting this content out to people, as opposed to it just being buried and nobody ever hears these stories.
My apologies to the owners of the Colonial Inn. I'm sorry that your terrible establishment was misidentified.
When we were leaving, my cousin, we were walking out. I was afraid she was going to say this. She turned around and just started yelling at the person behind the desk about how it was the dirtiest hotel ever. It was bad. Anyways, I want to say hi to Donnie Coulter. Said good morning from Ontario, Canada.
Oh.
Thanks for tuning in today, Donnie. We're back. We were doing a little research there. Hopefully you enjoyed the mixture there of the episodes of Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem. I had to get a little research there.
You got this? Can you see it? Where's the camera here?
Yeah, that looks good. There's my receipt there from the Colonial Inn.
Yeah.
And, which I think there's good reason why that place isn't there anymore. It was pretty nasty. But anyways, we're talking with Gavin Schmitt and Eric Wulterkens about the Fox Cities Murder, Mayhem, and the Milwaukee Mafia podcast. These gentlemen run both of those. And I'd like our listeners to know that we are taking your phone calls. If you've got a question, comment on the live feed, or better yet, give us a call. Want to say hi to Amy Wulterkens, who says hello from St. Paul. Hello, Amy, and thanks for tuning in. The number to call, if you want to call in, I've got it on the screen. It's 920-358-0795. If people want to find either podcast and listen to it, where should they go?
Well, every podcast is available on pretty much every platform. If you happen to find a platform that we're not on, please let us know. But otherwise, you can go to MilwaukeeMafia.com and you can find both podcasts. There is FoxCitiesMM.com is the actual website for Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, but you can just go to Milwaukee Mafia and it's right there too.
Yeah, Gavin's got a great website that kind of ties some Milwaukee Mafia one. It ties in the books, the podcasts, and everything. It's sort of like a one-stop shop.
Yeah, if you are an information nerd, Gavin's website is probably one of the coolest things you'll ever check out. So
yeah, so I don't think she wants us saying her name. She's kind of a behind-the-scenes person, but we have a very, very good behind-the-scenes person who helps us out and helps me out specifically. And the website has just been incredibly rejuvenated over the last few months. Yeah, the show notes are there, so if people prefer reading over listening to podcasts, I don't know why you would do that, but they're there. And things are getting cross-referenced there. One article will link to another article. We'll link them to the actual FBI files that some of the notes are taken from. So if you're really nerdy about it and you want to see the original documents that I'm using, those are linked onto the website. and it's continually growing. There's things being added each week. So, yeah, and of course you can always link to the books, buy the books if you want. But it really is just a great resource for going beyond the podcast. To me, the number one thing that I believe in is getting information out there. I'm not in it for fame or money. I just really like sharing information with people. So the website does a fantastic job of that.
And I highly recommend that if you do listen to the podcast, go check out the website, look at the FBI files, and realize this is what Gavin starts with and then condenses it down into this podcast, because it's quite amazing, because an FBI file has got to be the boringest thing in the world.
How hard is it to get the FBI files from the FBI?
It's not. It's gotten harder than it used to be, but not because it's harder to get them. It's just the wait list has gotten longer. It used to be when I started doing this, 10, 12, 15, whatever it is now, I don't know, time doesn't mean anything anymore. Whenever I started doing it, you'd put in a request and you'd get something back in a couple months, so relatively quick. And now I've got requests that I've put out in 2017 I still haven't seen back. So it's gotten to the point where it's not that they won't give you the file. They'll give it to you. You just have to wait forever.
We've got a caller. You're on the line with Gavin Schmitt and Eric Wulterkens. What's your question?
Hey, great show. I'm really interested in this stuff now where I wasn't before, so great content. Earlier in the show, they mentioned that they do crimes that normally didn't make the papers. I wonder where they get their material from, or where they do their investigative work that maybe the mainstream press had missed. Thanks.
Thank you for that call.
Okay. So as far as the Fox Cities one goes, that's primarily taken from the newspaper. So those are things that made the newspaper. The Milwaukee Mafia one is different because the way the FBI works, or at least used to work, I don't know if they still do it this way, but they'd work the opposite of the police. The police, somebody reports a crime, and then the police investigate it. The FBI is the exact opposite. They'll investigate somebody until they find a crime. So once somebody's on their radar, a file is opened, and they'll follow that person for, at a bare minimum, 6 months. Any file is open 6 months. Some of the files are open for 10 years or more, where they're following people around. And, this is where they had lunch. Here's a sampling of their phone records of who they've been in contact with. I mean, they were very serious about it. If they thought you had any connection to organized crime at all, or any kind of subversive activity, which in the 1960s, that's a pretty broad category, they'd open a file on you. So a lot of these stories, the reason they didn't make the newspaper is because they weren't supposed to be public stories. These were things that the FBI was writing in their paperwork, and at the time they were writing it, they didn't know this was going to be public, because the Freedom of Information Act that allows us to request government documents didn't go into effect until some point in the 1970s. I don't know exactly when, but at that point, then retroactively all the government documents become public, and you get to see all the embarrassing things that FBI agents were writing in their notes that they didn't think were going to go to the public. And it's funny because then after the point it changed, they issued this decree saying put anything embarrassing on the administrative page. Don't put it in the file, put it on the administrative page, which helped because when another agency like the DEA or the IRS or something would request information from the FBI, they'd send over the file, but they wouldn't send over the administrative page. But the administrative pages are now public too. So then you get to see that page where they're like, here's all the embarrassing things that we're not supposed to talk about. So I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but there's so many stories out there that didn't really make the paper because they weren't supposed to be known. They were things that they were taking down notes of things that they were investigating, but it never reached the point that it was worth arresting and prosecuting somebody for, or they couldn't 100% be sure that they had the right person. Because a lot of these times they're getting tips and they're fairly confident that they know who does what, but you can't always rely on just somebody saying that somebody was the one responsible for certain crimes. That's not a great way to, bring things to trial. This guy says this is what happened. Like, it doesn't hold up in court very well. So,
thank you for the question. And if anyone else has one, feel free to call in. We've got the number in the chat. We had a question from Greg Wulterkens.
oh no.
Do you have a white whale episode that you can't do for one reason or another?
That we can't do for one reason or another.
So I think he's asking, do you have like a...
I have an answer to that. You got an answer to that?
I can. Do you want me to?
Go for it.
We do have multiple episodes that. Well, first of all, we do have a rule of for anything. It's pretty much got to be 50 years old is typically what we try to stay at, just because people are still alive that maybe have connections to that. And
It's a loose rule, but yes.
Yeah. But on top of that, there are stories out there that we are waiting to tell, but waiting for somebody directly related to that story to maybe not be with us anymore to avoid offending anybody if that were to happen.
See how nicely he put that?
So,
yeah, I'll reiterate that. Yeah, with the Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, that is roughly a 50-year rule, for the reason being that sometimes we get a little jokey about things, and we don't mean to be disrespectful about it. And and we're local. We don't want somebody getting upset that we were making insensitive remarks about their parent being killed. That's, people don't like that. So after the 50-year mark, usually most people are they're not as sensitive about things anymore. And yeah, with the Mafia, the Mafia one, I have the limitation where the FBI doesn't release files on living people. So there are some topics that I really would like to tell, but the information isn't quite available yet, or not available as much as I'd like it to be. And also, I run into this is the legal issue where when I'm working off the paper is taken directly from the newspaper or an FBI file or whatever, and that's fine. But if we go off the cuff a little bit, I might accidentally say something that's not word for word exactly correct. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we live in a society where you can't say negative things about people without them getting, legal, I don't know the word, but I don't want to open myself up to legal responses if I accidentally say something that I can't 100% document. So I try to avoid talking about living people for that fact. Not that we're going up purposely lying about people, but you have to have that documentation.
Makes sense. Thank you for the question, Greg. If somebody was interested in starting their own podcast, do you have any advice?
well, the first thing I would tell anybody that's starting their own podcast is that it is not nearly as hard as you might think it is. The tools that they have out there today to create a podcast make it pretty streamlined. Just about anybody can do it. It's not expensive to start. If you are local, I would definitely tell anybody that's interested in doing it, get involved. There is an organization, very small organization in Appleton called the Appleton Podcast Co-op. You can find them at appletonpodcast.com. And they actually, it's just a group of people that are all podcasting. Believe it or not, in the Appleton area, there is over 16 podcasts that we have in this group right now. And you can get connected with them, and the people are happy to help out with learning how to create a podcast, you know, kind of give you the steps in the right direction. But the biggest part of it is, it's like anything, just get started with it, because it's not nearly as challenging as you might think. And the biggest part of it is just doing it. So, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I would add to that is it's the same as anything else in life. Don't be afraid to fail. We can speak from experience that our first several episodes, first 6 or 7, I mean, I don't know how long it was, we made some mistakes, and I think we've come a long way since then. So if you try it, it doesn't work out for you, I mean, stick with it. Learn from your mistakes and go forward. So same as anything else. If it's something you really truly believe in, just keep trying.
And despite the fact that, we made mistakes, we had audio issues in our first probably 5-6 episodes before we figured out what the problem was. But I don't really feel like that ever hurt our viewership of our podcast. From day one when we created the Milwaukee Mafia podcast, I looked at the numbers of it growing, and I'm like, I would have never expected this. So even though it wasn't the best quality content out there, and it probably still isn't today, but as long as you have good content, people will look past the shortcomings of maybe your abilities as an editor or something like that, and will still listen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm by no means a public speaker, and people still tune in anyway, so thank you.
We had a comment, I can't pronounce the name, Husku Vigwell. Seems like a fake name to me. It said vor.ngo. No idea what that means, but
Okay.
they're watching on YouTube. Thank you for tuning in.
Oh, okay.
Do you guys have a favorite episode you've done where you just did it got finished, and you're like, wow, that was awesome?
That's a you question.
Well, I mean, so just so you know, I'm very much more partial to Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem. I call that my podcast. So, and like you, Andy, I love the UFO episode. Pat on the back to me for that episode, because that turned out. And something I wanted to mention was when we first started talking about doing the UFO episode, Gavin just knew there was a UFO center in Appleton. He knew nothing more really than that, correct?
Right.
And as he went down, I remember the day we recorded that episode, that he came in and he's like, wow, dude, there was a lot more to this than I thought there was. So he's like, stand by, because this is way more than I ever expected this episode to be. So that was really fun to just kind of go down that rabbit hole and see that. Other things I really liked, like the Appleton Butcher episode. That's a really fun episode, because for anybody that doesn't know that story, that was, when was that, around what time?
1960 maybe?
In the 60s, and people just started finding body parts around Appleton. And in dumpsters and all just different places. Kids were kicking them around on playgrounds and stuff like that. And that episode is just really interesting, because I'd never heard that story before, ever in my life. And after we did that podcast, I started asking people about that, like, do you remember this? And everybody is like, oh yeah, I remember when that was going on. And it's a weird thing that something like that happened right here in Appleton. And as of now, it's just kind of forgotten about, and it's great to have that captured and for us to remember those things. So, and on the Mafia side, my personal favorite thing is we have a Patreon, and we do special episodes for the Patreon that it's much more casual, where me and Gavin just sit down and have a conversation. And I would say every one of those episodes is phenomenal. We go into a deep dive into how he does his records, how he goes out and gets FBI files, what goes into it, what the challenges are with it, how he peruses that information and stuff. Just a lot of really good behind the scenes type stuff for the Milwaukee Mafia, which I think is just...
How can somebody become a Patreon supporter? And for somebody that might not be familiar with what Patreon is, can you let the listeners know? So
Patreon is just basically a program that you can support a local or a podcast. And if you go to MilwaukeeMafia.com, you'll see a banner right on there for Patreon. It's basically, you pay $2 a month, and in addition to the free bi-weekly episode that we create. When we don't have a normal episode come out, we release bonus content, Patreon content, which is just available to the Patreon members to listen to. So,
I will jump onto the favorite episode thing. I don't necessarily have a favorite episode. In general, to me, what really gets me is not any particular episode. My brain is weird, and I love when things are networked, interlinked, interconnected. And what I love is how with the Milwaukee Mafia, each episode, no matter how random it is, somebody in that episode is going to come up that was in a previous episode. It's all just one continuous story, even when it doesn't feel like it. Now, I will say I agree with you on the Patreon, not to pimp out the Patreon, but I will agree with you on that. What I love about the Patreon is, first of all, it is very casual. I don't come with any notes at all. We just talk. But what I love is we have a question, and more often than not, Eric will have the list of questions, and he'll be like, "This question doesn't look interesting at all." and then after the 20 minutes, half hour, whatever it is, conversation, he's like, "There was a lot more going on there than I thought." And he ends up actually being really interested on something that he didn't think he cared about at all. And that to me is fun, because he's like, "This sounds so boring. Why would I care?" But then he does.
Yeah.
So I think the Patreon would really have a lot to offer to people who, might think that a lot of like the behind the scenes stuff is boring, because we don't present. I don't think we present it in a boring way. I think we actually really make it interesting. The idea of researching, like, oh, that sucks. I had to do that in school. I don't want to do that. It actually can be fun if you're working on the right topics.
And I do want to reiterate too something he said. I do also love the Milwaukee Mafia interconnection. Like, he is basically, through this podcast, he creates a world, and you will see people pop up from all different times of the world. I mean, right now we're in the 60s? Are we?
Not even yet. We just finished 55.
Okay, so the 50s. I mean, you might hear a name that showed up in an episode in the 20s and the 50s, or at least maybe not a name but a relative or something like that. And it's just crazy how everything is interconnected. And I think that's part of the beauty of the Milwaukee Mafia, is because the Milwaukee Mafia was relatively small. So you do get that tight interconnection all the way along the history line of it. Mm-hmm. So,
well, I want to thank you guys for hopping on. It really was a pleasure having you guys on the show.
We're done already?
I know, we're done already. Before we sign off, I want to remind everybody that Code Zero Radio, if you're watching us on any of our streams, you can tune in online. You can find us on TuneIn. If you go to live.codezeroradio.com, there's web links. Lots of different ways you can listen to us. We've got lots of on-demand content if you download our app. Lots of cool stuff there. And we also have Ike Arumba starting up with a new show. If you guys have never heard of Ike, you might find his show very good. He's a musician from the area, but he's got a ton of good stories. He used to live in Seattle, and he's an endless book of stories. But you'll want to tune in for that show Tuesday night after Amped Up, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Let's end it with, where can people go again to find out more about the podcasts and find out more about Gavin's books? Let's do the elevator pitch here to end off the show.
Gavin, do your typical podcast pimp out.
All right. At the end of every podcast episode, I get to say, you can find us at MilwaukeeMafia.com. You can email me directly at MilwaukeeMafia@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at Facebook.com/Milwaukee Mafia. Anywhere you go and you type in Milwaukee Mafia, one way or another, you're going to find your way back to us.
I love it. Thank you, Gavin Schmitt, Eric Wulterkens, for being on Fox Cities Core. And go check out Milwaukee Mafia and the Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem podcasts. You've been listening to Core on WCZR, Code Zero Radio.